All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Eli, and I am the pastor here at Nickel City Church, and I'm excited about today. We are continuing in our series called Stand, and so I'm excited that you're here today to be a part of it. Now, I wanted to start off today with a quick survey, so if you'll help me out. So here's the thing. I tend to be an overpacker when it comes to going on a trip, even if it's like a little 2 or 3 day trip. My wife will pack for our 3 kids and for herself, and she'll say to me, Eli, just pack what you need, which is wonderful. It's great. But what ends up happening is I will start packing a suitcase, and that suitcase will then turn into a suitcase plus a duffel bag, and then it will turn into a suitcase plus a duffel bag plus a backpack plus my laptop bag, and I end up with too much stuff. Anyone overpack here? All right. So I think I have a theory that there's 3 different types of people when it comes to packing. The first type of person is the person who is super organized. I mean, these are the people who come together and they say, well, according to my calculations, I'm going to need 2 t-shirts, 1 pair of shorts, 1 pair of jeans, and 3 pairs of underwear, and that is all that I need for this trip. And so they are typically prepared in advance. Maybe they pack their bags a few days ahead of time. They put them in a small little bag by the front door. Maybe they even put them in the car, so they're just ready to go on their way to the airport. Anyone like that? Anyone say, I am a prepared packer? Okay. All right, we got quite a few. Man, I applaud you guys. That's awesome. I wish I was like that, but I am more like this second category of people. The second category would be people who are maybe prepared mentally, and they know what they want to pack. They know what they need to pack, but what ends up happening is they wait until the last minute. And so, at least in my life, this is what happens is I'll kind of know what I need to pack and what I want to pack, but because I'll wait to the last minute, I will start to get kind of anxious and overwhelmed, and I'll have this fear of forgetting something. So I will start throwing in as much stuff as I can, and because I don't want to forget anything, and that's why I tend to overpack. Is there anyone here in that same category who's like, I'm pretty prepared mentally, but I know that I overpack because I wait till the last minute? All right. Then there's one more type of person that I think fits into this category. And these are the people who wake up the morning of and go, dang it, I have to leave. And these are the people who typically just kind of rush out the door and they just grab what they can get. I had a friend, true story, who came to our house, was visiting from out of town, and the first thing he said as he came into our door, he didn't say, hey, how's it going? We didn't exchange pleasantries. His first words to me were, do you have any socks I can use? That was his first words to me. And then I was like, yeah, I got you, whatever. And as the night went on and we were getting ready for bed, he then came and said, hey, can I use your toothbrush? No, you cannot use my toothbrush. That is like a personal item. No one has ever used my toothbrush. That is not I'll drive you to the store and I'll get you a toothbrush, but no, you cannot use my toothbrush. Anyone like that you're just last minute and you always forget something? Anyone? A few of you. All right, a few brave ones willing to admit it. Well, today as we continue in this series, we are talking about that idea, and specifically this week, we're talking about this idea of being prepared and what it looks like to be prepared. In fact, I want to go ahead and I want to read some of these verses. Since we're kind of midway through this series, I want to recap and just read some of the verses that we're talking about, just to kind of give us a reference again of what we're being prepared for. And so let's go ahead and read in the book of Ephesians. It says this, a final word, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you'll be able to stand firm against the strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Therefore, put on every piece of God's armor so that you will be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil. Then after the battle, you will still be standing firm. Stand your ground, putting on the belt of truth and the body armor of God's righteousness. For shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news so that you will be fully prepared. In addition to all of these things, hold up the shield of faith to stop the fiery arrows of the devil. Put on salvation as your helmet and take the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And so this is the reason why. This is what we need to be prepared for. This is what we need to gear up for. The Bible says that there's this spiritual battle that is taking place. This battle that's happening in the unseen world. And although we can't see it, we are still in it and we're affected by it. So Paul, the writer of this, the Apostle Paul, tells us to gear up and to get ready and to be ready and prepared to stand in the midst of all of this. Now, just one more recap. If we remember, the Apostle Paul was actually in prison or house arrest when he wrote this. So he was spending a lot of time with the Roman army and centurions and the Roman military. And so as we see his writings and as he kind of compares some of these things that we should do, it's so clear that he was spending time with these Roman soldiers and looking at their process and looking at how intentional they were in every piece of the armor and putting on every piece of the armor. And so he kind of is telling us to do the same thing, that we need to be just as intentional, that we need to gear up and get ready and be intentional in putting on this armor of God. Now, we're going to be focusing today in verse 15. In verse 15 it says, "For shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news so that you will be fully prepared." And I really love this. I don't know if you're allowed to have favorites in the Bible, if you can have a favorite verse, but if I had to have a favorite verse in this entire passage, it would be this one. And this is the reason why. Because Paul tells us the what, the why, and the how, all in this little verse right here. And that's really what we're going to dive into today, kind of looking at the what, the why, and the how. And so before we jump into this, I want to talk a little bit about shoes. Now, in my life, packing my clothes and packing up, I tend to have a lot of shoes that I'll take with me on a trip. And that's because my shoes all play different roles. And my wife will look at me and go, "Eli, you don't need to take 5 different pairs of shoes on this trip. We're going to be gone for 3 days." But I'm like, but they all do something different. I want to be prepared, all right? And so I'll tell her, I'll be like, "Yeah, but look, these are like my casual shoes. These are like just comfy, just kind of walking around, whatever. They're just my casual type of shoes." And so I want to take them. Or my next pair of shoes, I'll pull out and be like, "Yeah, and these are my athletic shoes." If my friends call me up and say, "Hey, you want to go do something fun or athletic or active?" I want to have my active shoes. I want to be prepared to run and jump and do all those things. Or I'll pull out another one. These are my extremely fun, bright, colorful shoes. And the reason that I have them is in case I have to preach on the armor of God and I have to talk about the gospel shoes of peace, I want to have my most colorful, fun shoes on. You never know when that's going to happen, right? So I will have all different shoes that fill different purposes. But back in Bible times, that's not the way that it was. In fact, they typically just owned one pair of shoes, and especially if you were in the Roman army, you were given one pair of shoes, and it was a pair of sandals. And so sometimes as I look at kind of history and as I look at what these sandals were, just kind of from a glance, I'm like, they don't seem super practical. I kind of picture all these guys in flip-flops, like chasing down, going to battle with their spears, and they're just flip-flopping along. But that's not exactly what these were. In fact, these sandals were very specifically made, and they were designed with a purpose. And so as I kind of dug and did some historical research, I learned a lot about this, and I'm excited to share this part here today. So Roman sandals, especially for Roman soldiers, they were specifically designed to meet the needs of the Roman army. And so the first way that we would look at is that they were designed differently is by the way that they had the straps. And so they were the kind that would strap all the way up almost to your ankle. And the straps were placed so strategically as to not rub on your bone of your foot and to be able to be worn for long periods of times. And that was kind of the idea. They said, these are shoes that you're going to have on. You aren't going to get a chance to kick off your shoes when you're in the army, so we want these to be comfortable and practical in the same sense. The straps that they would use for for the shoes were actually specifically designed as well. They picked out some soft aged leather so that they could put it on, and if it got wet, it would be okay if they walked through mud or through rain, as well as it would dry quickly so that they would not be waterlogged in their feet. And so these shoes were just specifically designed to meet these needs. It goes on further. The sole of these sandals was actually a lot thicker than normal shoes as well, because they wanted them to be prepared to go through any terrain. And as well as one other feature that I didn't know existed, but I thought it was so interesting, that it didn't come standard in the army, but soldiers were able to purchase additionally kind of like spikes, or almost to turn their sandals into cleats, or spikes if you've ever played baseball or football. They would sell different pieces that could latch in and give you grip so that if you were in battle, you'd be able to stand your ground. And so as we kind of know this information about the shoes and how specifically they were designed and what they were designed to do, I just kind of get this mental image. I see Paul sitting at his house, and these soldiers are coming through. And as they're coming through and they're sitting down there, looking at their sandals, and maybe one comes in, he says, "Hey man, did you see, I got the attachments. I got like the Yeezy spikes that I can put into my sandals, and now I can stand," right? And so it just kind of gives this image of the care that they took of these sandals, because they were such an important part of allowing them to be able to be mobile and to really fight in battle. Now, as we kind of go back to this idea, we talked about how Paul addresses the what, the how, and the why. He talks about what we need to do, how we need to do it, and why. And so let's jump into this with the what. Paul talks about the what, and he says the what that we should do is to put on peace, that we should put on peace into our lives. And I think we should ask ourselves the question of what is peace? As we look in the dictionary today, we have a definition of peace, and it is typically along the lines of it's the absence of something in our lives. We think of peace as the absence of bad things. In fact, if you have the absence of noise, then we think that is peace, right? And that makes sense. My wife and I, we have 3 kids, and so there are times when we put our kids to bed, and then we just sit on the couch silently, and we're like, there's peace, there's absence of crying and noise and everything. It's just kind of relaxing. So a lot of times we think of it in that sense. Another way we think of it is kind of the absence of war. If you say, hey, there needs to be peace in the Middle East, we would be talking about the absence of conflict or the absence of war in that territory. Still, another time we would say that a peace is the absence of that it's the absence of hardships or struggles. I think that, if you've had anyone close to you in life pass away or die, maybe you've said something like this. You're like, man, it was really hard, but I'm at peace now. And that kind of indicates the idea that, hey, I was feeling a certain way and I was really struggling, but now the peace has kind of come in. Now the struggle has left, and now I'm kind of subduing the pain, and so I would consider myself more at peace. And so a lot of times in our world today, we consider peace as the absence of bad things in our lives. But the Bible actually uses a different definition, and as we look at the Greek word for peace, it's not talking about the absence of bad things in our lives, but it actually refers to the wholeness or the completeness of good things in our lives. And so it's not the absence of bad things, but it's the completeness of the good things. And this would be more what Paul is talking about in this verse, putting on the wholeness or the completeness. And so I think a lot of times in our lives we look for that. We look for completeness, or we look for wholeness, and we search for it in different areas. We kind of search for this idea of a holistic life where everything is balanced and everything comes together. Maybe in your life you said something like, well, man, if I could just get in a relationship, then I feel like I would have peace, or then I feel like I'd have fulfillment in my life. Or maybe if I could just get married, then I would have fulfillment, or then I would have purpose, and then I'd have peace, and I'd be at a good place if I could just get married. Maybe you're sitting here today and you've said, well, maybe if I could just get that promotion in my job, maybe if I could get recognition for my work, then I'll start to have peace. Then I'll start to feel fulfilled in my life, and I'll attain this kind of idea of wholeness or being made complete. If I just kind of move up the corporate ladder or just take a few more steps and gain some recognition. Maybe we say, well, if I could just lose the weight, if I could just meet my goals, if I could just get out of debt, if I could just hit the lottery, then I would be complete in my life and kind of I would have peace where I'd have this wholeness and completeness in my life. And I think a lot of times we search for peace in this way, and we kind of strive for it, and we desire this wholeness or this completeness for our lives. And so what we'll do is we'll oftentimes push through to the next season. Be like, well, if I can just push really hard through this hard season, and if I can just get through to the other side of this problem or the other side of this, then on the other side I'll find that fulfillment, or I'll find the peace, or I'll find this wholeness that I've been searching for. But the hard thing is that as we push and as we kind of give it our all to get through these seasons, oftentimes we push through and we find that there's just another season of something even harder, something more difficult, and we find that we aren't truly finding the peace that we so eagerly desire, that we aren't finding the wholeness or the completeness. And so we get stuck in this kind of vicious cycle. And we get stuck in this cycle, and anxiety and fear and worry and doubt start to creep into our lives. And we say, well, I just don't know anymore. I don't know where I'm going to find this. And we keep longing for more and searching for bigger things. And we get stuck in this cycle. In fact, I think of so many kind of millionaires and rock stars who are such an example of this. That they have everything that they ever could want, yet they fall into depression. They fall into drug use. Some of them commit suicide because they feel like there's no hope. They feel like this wholeness of life is out of reach for them or is out of grasp. And so we can't find our peace in any of these things. We're looking for peace oftentimes in places that can never truly fulfill us, that can never truly make us whole. But I love that the Bible doesn't just leave us with what to do. More oftentimes than not in the Bible, it tells us how to go about doing it. And so Paul does that. He's such a great example. He says, so put on peace. That's the what. This is what you need in your life. You need peace. But then he tells us where to find it. He tells us how to attain it. And he says, put on the peace that comes from the good news. That comes from the gospel, some translations would say, which is the good news about Jesus. That's really what it's talking about when it says the good news. It's the good news that Jesus came down to earth to live his life as a man. And as he lived this life, he saw us in our brokenness. He saw us in our sin. He saw us in our depression. He saw us in this cycle that we couldn't escape from. And he said, I'm going to give my life to give you hope, to give you peace. Because now you have a way to be right with God. So this is the good news. That's what we're talking about. It's the story of Jesus. In fact, there are 4 books in the Bible that we call the Gospels. And the Gospels mean good news. The word gospel means good news. And those are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we call them the Gospels because those are the 4 books that outline the life of Jesus. And so this is where Paul tells us that we can find this type of wholeness, this type of completeness. It's in the story of Jesus. Now, maybe you're sitting here today and you go, well, Eli, that's a nice thought, but man, how does the story of Jesus really change my life? How does the story of Jesus give me peace or wholeness in every area of my life? I mean, I still face depression. Man, my job situation is still rough. I'm searching. I'm not finding a job. And this relationship, I still have issues, and I don't know what to do. How is the story of Jesus, how is the good news of Jesus supposed to bring me hope in my everyday life? Well, I think that in order to find this peace that Paul's talking about, the peace that comes from the good news of Jesus, we have to be willing to shift our perspective. And I think that this peace is available to everyone, But I think it requires us kind of taking a step outside of ourselves and searching and being willing to open up our perspective a little bit. And so today I wanted to do an illustration. And I want to invite Jaron to come on up. You might know Jaron. Jaron is on the worship team. He plays electric guitar here or bass. Oh, yeah, you can give it up for Jaron. Jaron's a good guy. We like Jaron. And so here we have Jaron, and Jaron's brought up some things. Jaron, this bucket, it represents your life, okay? And so this is your life. I hope that you live a really nice, long life. I hope you live to be like 128 years old. Does that sound good? Like right around there? Okay, somewhere around there. So this represents your life. And you guys can kind of do this with me too. This bucket represents all of our lives. We all have a bucket. Well, what happens is that this water represents each day of our lives. And so each drop represents a different day or a different moment of our lives. And so let's just kind of go through Jaron's life a little bit. You can think along in your life in these moments. But the first thing that happens, right, the first drop is you were born. You were born, Jaron, and I can just picture you being just the cutest little bald brown baby, right, that I could ever imagine. Or maybe you weren't bald. Maybe you had the little swoop coming right out. What do you think? Yeah, he had the swoop. Okay, he says that he had the swoop from birth. But that was the day. Your parents were probably so thrilled. They were happy, and they spent a few more days in the hospital, right? They were there, and finally, this is the day that you came home. And they were thrilled. They strapped you up in a car seat, and they brought you home. But you didn't stay little. You grew up, and so we'll give you a few more drops in here as you continued to grow up. And now this drop here represents the moment that you took your first step. And so you took your first step, and you were a little bit wobbly at first. And you kind of fell, but good job. Good job, Jaron. You took your first step. That's an awesome thing. And you continued to grow. And then you said your first word. And you began to speak full sentences. And you grew up in a lot of different ways. And then later in your life, we see more days go by, more drops in your bucket. We see that you went to school, your first day of school. And maybe your parents took the first day of school pictures, and you were in a little embarrassing outfit. And they sent you off to the bus. Do you think that your parents cried when you went to school? Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe they cried, maybe they didn't, but you probably were looking snazzy in your backpack, and probably you were wearing suspenders. I can just picture that. I don't know why. I can see that. But these are all moments of your life that were good moments, right? And then you grew up even more, and then you went to college, and you started off this search for your degree, and so you started achieving things and attaining things in your life, and so you have a lot of moments that you lived. Now, I'm not going to fill this all the way up to the top because, again, we want you to live to be 128 or so. So I don't want to fill this up because that means that it's the end of your life. But all of these drops, all of these moments, they represent a day in your life. Now, it wasn't just all good times. There were moments in your life that were difficult too. I'm sure there was moments when you felt depressed. There's probably moments that you felt hopeless, or you didn't feel like you knew where to go or what to do with your life, or you kind of had questions or maybe even doubts. And so there was moments in your life that were great, but there's also some moments, some drops, some days that felt like, man, I don't know how I'm going to get through this life. And maybe you guys have been there as well. Have you had days like that in your life? So we all live these moments in our lives, and it's full of these days. And sometimes they're great, sometimes they're difficult. But here's what I want us to do. I want us to shift our perspective a little bit. Because each of these days of our lives, they represent a piece of us. But I want to kind of look outside our moment. So we have another bucket here. Will you grab that one? Thanks. And so this bucket, it represents time. It represents history. This is a moment, because we know that people lived before us, right? We know that people will live after us. We know that there's time that happened before we were ever here on earth. And we also know that there's time that will go on beyond our time here on earth as well. And so this bucket represents history. And so what I want us to do is I want us to shift our perspective, maybe just from our lives, and let's put it in the context of history. And so if you'll pour in your life and the moments you've lived so far. Okay. Yeah, so you've lived, and this is your life in context of history, in context of all the people who have ever lived, all the time that has ever passed, and all the time that will pass in the future. Well, as we start to see this, and maybe you can see this moment, I'm not sure if you can really tell, but you can start to see a little bit about how maybe our problems or our struggles or the things that we go through in this moment aren't as big of a deal as maybe we once thought. Maybe as we put them in comparison to the struggles of other people in the world, as we kind of look at the context of history and of time, we start to see, well, maybe the things that I'm dealing with right now aren't as big of a deal as I might once have thought. So I think something beautiful happens as we start to change our perspective. But the Bible goes beyond that. It doesn't just talk about history. It talks about this idea of eternity. It talks about a life beyond this earth. See, we know that at one point that our buckets will get filled. We'll come to the end of our lives. But the Bible says that if we believe in Jesus and if we trust in him, that we will have a hope of eternity, that we will then spend forever with God. That we'll spend the rest of forever in his presence, that we will spend the rest of our lives, the rest of eternity, in a place that he designed for us, in a place that has no more hurting, no more sorrow, no more pain, no more death. That sounds pretty great, right? And so I don't just want us to think about our lives in a history standpoint. I want us to start thinking about it in an eternal perspective, to shift our perspective, to shift our context. So if you'll take your life again, and if you'll come over to our big kind of our baptism tank here, and I want you to pour out your life in the context of eternity. All right, so you guys can't see this here, but Jaron, will you help me kind of describe what does this look like? Like, what do your problems and your days here on earth look like in the context of eternity?
Really small. Really small.
Really? Are you sure? Because, I mean, we did this for the first service, too, so there was even double the amount of water. Are you sure that it's, I mean, I can hardly even see it in there. It's a few spots. See, here's the idea. Right? As we shift our perspective, as we shift our context to being from just our lives or the drops that we have into our own life, the days that we're here on earth, as we start to broaden our horizon, as we start to look at the context of our lives in history, as we start to look at our lives in the context of eternity, it starts to bring kind of a new perspective. It helps us to start to see, yeah, you know what, maybe life is really difficult right now, but maybe it is also not. Maybe the fact that I had a really bad day and that I stubbed my toe, maybe that really doesn't matter in all of the context of eternity. Now, let's give it up for Jaron. Jaron did a great job. Thank you for being a part of that, Jaron. Now, here's the thing, guys. I know that life is difficult sometimes. I know that there's hardships, and I don't want to downplay that at all. I know that there are days that you feel like you can't get through. I know that there's moments in your life that you're like, man, this drop in my bucket, it feels like I just can't move. It feels like I can't go any further. But I think something beautiful happens as we start to shift our perspective to this idea of eternity. Now, I want to be clear that this is different than faith. Peace is different than faith. Next week, we're going to talk about the shield of faith. And man, I'm excited for that. Faith is the idea of believing that God has the ability to change your circumstances. Faith is the ability to see and believe that God is good even in the midst of hardships. Faith is the ability to believe that God is going to work and change your future. In fact, the song that we sang, I believe I'm going to see a victory. That's all about faith. I believe God can change my circumstances. But today, I want to focus on peace. Peace is different than faith. Faith is saying, I believe God can change my circumstances. But peace is saying that even in the midst of my circumstances, even in the midst of my pain, even in the midst of my problems, I still have hope because I know that it's not the end of my story. I know that drop in the bucket, I know that even if the rest of the drops in my bucket are filled with pain and tears and hardship, that I know that that's not the end of my story, but there is a hope and a peace and a wholeness that comes from the good news of Jesus. And I know that it's just the start of something beautiful. In fact, if you really want to get a true picture of eternity, you got to take these few drops, and go over to Niagara Falls and dump it over the edge. That is a true picture of eternity. Eternity goes on and on. It can't be confined. It can't be limited. And so as we kind of look at the context of eternity, I think it changes our perspective. See, this is the type of peace that Paul talks about. He says it's a peace, a wholeness that comes from the good news of Jesus. It's a peace that says, hey, things might be horrible in my life. Things might be difficult in my life. And you know what? Even if the worst thing happens, I still can find security. I still can find wholeness and completeness because I know it's not the end of my story. I love that Paul says this because in another letter, he gives us a perfect example of this peace. I want to go ahead and read that in the book of Philippians. Paul writes this, and I love that he practices what he preaches too, right? Paul kind of, I would say he coined the phrase because he says, I'm doing this as well. I'm not just telling you what to do, but I'm showing you how to do this. And he writes in another letter, always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Let everyone see that you are considerate or intentional in all you do. Remember, the Lord is coming soon. Man, what a perspective shift, right? Hey, don't focus on your bucket. But look, there is something bigger. The Lord is coming soon. You have eternity to look forward to and to hope towards. He says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he has done. Then you will experience God's peace, his wholeness, his completeness in your life, which exceeds anything that we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. And I love this because he goes on in one more section. And the people that he's writing to here, they're hurting and they're broken. They're being persecuted and they're getting killed because they believe in Jesus. And so he writes to them this. He says, listen, I see all the bad stuff. I know all these things are happening in your life. But he shifts their perspective and he goes on to tell them, and one final thing, fix your thoughts on what's true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice all you've learned and received from me, everything that you've heard from me and saw me doing. Then the God of peace will be with you. Man, he says, listen, I know it's rough. I know you're struggling. And I don't want to downplay that, but now let's shift our perspective. Let's focus on the things that are true. Let's focus on the things that bring hope and joy, because we know that as bad as our bucket gets, as bad as the drop gets, that it's not the end of our story. In fact, just a verse or two later is where Paul writes a phrase that maybe we are very familiar with. He goes on and he says, I've learned to be content in all my circumstances. For I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. He's talking about his circumstances there. He's talking about, hey, in plenty or in need, whether I have a lot or whether I have a little, it doesn't matter, because I can get through. I can have peace in the middle of my circumstances, and I can get through because I can conquer this in Jesus' name. Man. This is a wholeness, a completeness that we can't find on our own. We can't find it in our relationships. We can't find it in our jobs. We can't find it in our accomplishments here on earth. He says, what do you need? You need peace. How do you find it? It's through the good news of Jesus. That's how you get it. And peace is such an important thing. It's the peace that comes from the gospel. And that brings us to the why, the last part of this. See, Paul says that we need the peace that comes from the gospel, but then he goes on and he tells us why. He says, so that you will be fully prepared. See, life is going to be difficult. Life is going to be hard. There's going to be moments that you have that drop in a bucket and you're like, man, I don't feel like I can get through this. There's going to be moments that you're like, I'm just not sure I can carry on. I don't know what to do. I've lost hope. I've lost joy in my life. I feel depressed. There's going to be days like that. But that's why Paul says, be prepared. That as you find peace that comes from the gospel, it's for the purpose that you can be prepared when those days come. Rather than being reactive to the problems that come at us, we can be prepared. We can be prepared to stand in the midst of them. So I think here's what we need to do. We need to ask ourselves the question. Is the gospel, is the good news of Jesus, the story of Jesus, enough for us? Is it enough to give us this kind of peace? Is it enough to give us wholeness and completeness, even in the midst of our worst circumstances? Even if nothing changes for the better, is the gospel, the good news of Jesus, enough for us? If your worst fears come alive in your life, if you lose everything you've worked for, is the good news of Jesus enough for you? To know that it's not about this moment, it's not even about this bucket, but that there's a hope of eternity and there's a peace and a wholeness and completeness that comes through the story of Jesus. As we close, I want to end with a story. I want to read this to you, and it's a true story. And this is a story of a man who lived a while back, and he is the writer of a very famous hymn, and it's a hymn called It Is Well. And maybe you've heard it if you've been in church, or if you've gone to a funeral, maybe you've heard that hymn. Well, I want to read a story of this man's life as he was writing this hymn. It says, Horatio Spafford was a successful lawyer and businessman in Chicago with a lovely family. He had a wife, Anna, and 5 children. However, they were not strangers to the tears and tragedy. Their young son died with pneumonia in 1871. And in that same year, much of their business was lost in the Great Chicago Fire. Yet God in His mercy and kindness allowed their business to flourish once more. On November 21st, 1873, the French ocean liner Ville de Havre was crossing the Atlantic from the U.S. to Europe with 313 passengers on board. Among the passengers were Mrs. Spafford and their 4 daughters. Although Mr. Spafford had planned on going with his family, he found it necessary to stay in Chicago to help solve some unexpected business problems. He told his wife that he would join her and their children in Europe a few days later. His plan was to take another ship. About 4 days into crossing the Atlantic, their ship collided with a powerful iron-hulled Scottish ship. Suddenly, all of those on board were in grave danger. Anna hurriedly brought her 4 children onto the deck. She knelt there with them and prayed that God would spare them if that would be His will, or at least to make them willing to endure whatever awaited them. Within approximately 12 minutes, the ship slipped beneath the dark waters of the Atlantic, carrying with it 226 of the passengers, including the 4 Spafford children. A sailor rowing a small boat over the spot where the ship went down spotted a woman floating on a piece of the wreckage. It was Anna. She was alive. He pulled her into the boat, and they were picked up by another large vessel, which 9 days later brought them to the shore. From there, she wired her husband the message which began, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" Mr. Spafford later framed the telegram and placed it in his office. Another of the ship's survivors later recalled Anna saying, "God gave me 4 daughters, and now they've been taken from me. Someday, I will understand why." Mr. Spafford booked passage on the next available ship and left to join his grieving wife. With the ship about 4 days out, the captain called Spafford to his cabin, and he told them that they were over the place where the ship went down and where his children had died. It was there, over that spot, that Mr. Spafford wrote the words to the song, "It Is Well." I want to read you just a verse of this song. It says this, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, or when sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, you have taught me to say, it is well with my soul." Wow. Man, this is the type of peace that we're talking about. Mr. Spafford was not in a good place. He was not full of joy or hope in this moment. He just lost the 4 daughters that he loved so much. But yet he was able to stand with the confidence and the courage to say, even on my worst day, even though this is the worst day of my life, even though this is the worst drop that will ever hit my bucket, I still have confidence to know that this is not the end of the story. Even though I feel pain, even though I feel the hardships, even though I'm grieving and I don't know what to do, I still in this moment have the confidence to say, God, I know there's wholeness and completeness found in you. I know that there's this big bucket that's awaiting, a place with no more sorrow, with no more pain, with no more death. That is a peace that is tangible. That is a peace that I want to have in my life. I mean, I look at where he was at and how he could say these words, "It's well with my soul." It's a peace to know that even in the midst of problems, that it's not the end of the story, but there's hope and there's a future that God has for you. So here's what I want us to do. We're going to just sing one verse and one chorus of this song together. It's this song, "It Is Well." But I don't want us just to sing this song. I don't want this just to be a moment where we sing a song and kind of wrap up. I want this to be a moment in our lives where we are stepping into this type of peace, where we step in and say, you know what? In the midst of my hardship, in the midst of my pain, I want to have this type of peace. And so as we sing these words, these powerful words that came out of this tragic event, I would encourage you to give it to God, to say, God, listen, on my worst day, I still want to have peace. Even if everything goes wrong in my life from here on out, God, I still want to be able to stand and say, I know that there's a future. I know it's not the end of my story, but it's the beginning of something beautiful. So I would encourage you in this moment as we sing this song to use it as a moment to respond to God. Now listen, if you're here today and you say, I don't have a relationship with God, Eli, I don't know about this hope of eternity. I've been kind of just living from my own bucket. I don't know anything about this, but man, I would like to. Some of our leaders will be available on the sides. Go talk to them, go pray with them, because we want to give you the ability. We want you to be able to step into the peace of what eternity looks like. And so they'll be available during this. But for the rest of us who already are saying, I know that there is an eternity, I know where I'm going, I would encourage you, let's take this moment to respond and say, God, even in the midst of my tragedy, even in the midst of my pain, I'm still choosing peace. I'm still choosing a completeness and wholeness that can only be found in the good news of Jesus. Let's sing this together.
It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.
to God.
is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.
Let's just pray together. God, we are grateful that you make peace available to us. God, that you don't just tell us that we need peace in our lives and then leave us to try to find it on our own, God, but that you give us a completeness and a wholeness, and you tell us that it can be found in the good news of Jesus. God, we thank you for that. We thank you for what Jesus did for us. We thank you that there is hope and life beyond our own bucket, beyond the drops that we face and the hardships that we face, God. We thank you that there is a newness and a time that you will make things well again, that you will make things complete. God, we thank you and we look forward to that moment where we get to be with you face to face, God. God, but I pray for these moments right now. God, I pray that we would be prepared, that when the moments of difficulty come, God, that when the moments of tragedy strike, God, that when the unexpected happens, God, that you would help us to be prepared to say those words, to say, it is well, because I know this is not the end of the story. God, help us to change our perspective. Help us to think in the context of eternity, because what we do today matters for eternity. God, give us a peace and a completeness that comes from the good news of Jesus, so that we can be prepared to stand in the midst of life, in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of attack from the enemy. God, we need you. We can't do this on our own. So we surrender to you. We say, have your way in our lives. Help us to stand firm and rooted in you. We love you. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Guys, I'm so glad you were here with us today. Just a quick reminder, Friday is our worship night. I would encourage you, man, we're believing for breakthrough. We're believing that God's going to show up in a real way. We're believing that people's lives are going to be changed, because anytime that we come to the realization of God, is every time that we come in the presence of God, we have the ability to be changed in our lives. And so come worship with us. It's going to be a great time. I also want to invite you back next week. We're going to be continuing this series talking about the shield of faith. Our very own Christina is going to be preaching, so I'm super excited. I'm gearing up, getting ready for it. It's going to be a great time. So I would encourage you to come, to bring someone with you. We love you guys, and we'll see you all Friday.